Scrap iron. That's all that is, son. You're telling me you want to build a house out of scrap iron? Curtis Hargrove was 19 years old. He had $67 in his pocket, a quarter-acre of bad ground his father had given him, and an idea nobody in Hardin County thought was worth a nickel. It was a Tuesday morning in March of 1962. A crew was tearing out 2 miles of dead railroad on the north edge of the county, and everything worth hauling was already stacked for the scrap buyer. What was left lay in the weeds: short ends, bent pieces, rail worn crooked by 50 years of wheels. Curtis walked over and asked if he could have it. The contractor laughed, not a polite laugh, the laugh of a man who has just heard something he considers genuinely ridiculous. "Help yourself. Haul off all the garbage you can carry." 9 years later, that same man would drive up Curtis Hargrove's lane and ask him how it was done. If you like stories about the people everybody underestimated, take a second and subscribe. It genuinely helps these get made. Let me tell you who was standing on that grade that morning, because you need both men before any of the rest of it makes sense. The contractor's name was Rick Thornton, Thornton Construction, out of Iowa Falls. He was 34 years old. He had a new Ford pickup and a crew of 5, and he had the particular confidence of a man who has won every argument he has ever been in. The railroad had hired him for the unglamorous half of an abandonment. The scrap buyer took the long rail, the full 33-foot sticks worth hauling. Thornton's contract was everything else: pull the ties, break up the grade, level the roadbed back down to something a farmer could disc in the spring. Which meant the short ends and the bent pieces lying in the weeds were nobody's problem anymore. Not the railroads, not the scrap buyers. They were Rick Thornton's garbage, contractually. And as it turned out, in every other sense of the word. Roland Hargrove farmed 320 acres of corn and beans in the flat middle of Hardin County, and he farmed it the way his own father had: carefully, quietly, and without much waste. Roland was not a man who talked about money. He was a man who thought about it constantly. And what he thought about it was that the difference between a farm that survives and a farm that goes under is almost never yield. It is almost always what you spend. He passed that down the way farmers pass most things, not by instruction, but by 1,000 small decisions his boys watched him make until they added up into a philosophy. The Hargroves were one of 3 black families in Hardin County. Curtis's grandfather, Silas Hargrove, had come north in 1923 with a railroad section gang, and when the gang moved on, he stayed. He bought ground nobody else wanted, and he worked it, and 40 years later, his son was still working it. That's the ground this story stands on. I'm not going to keep pointing at it. You'll see it where it shows. Curtis was the middle of 3 sons. He was not the strongest. He was not the fastest. He was the one who watched. The ground his father offered him was not a gift. It was a low, poorly drained quarter-acre in the northeast corner of the place, hemmed in by a drainage ditch on 2 sides and a windbreak of old cottonwoods on the 3rd. Nobody had ever farmed it successfully. Roland offered it to his son the way fathers sometimes do, as a test, to see what a young man does with a problem that has no obvious solution. What Curtis decided to do with it was build a house. Not a big house. A small, tight, efficient house on a poured slab, with good insulation and a simple roof line and enough room for a man and eventually a family to live in without spending money they did not have. He drew the plans himself over the winter on graph paper at the kitchen table after chores. Then he went to Eldora to price it out. Lumber, cement, nails, windows, roofing. The man behind the counter ran the numbers twice and gave him a figure between $800 and $1,000 for materials alone. $67 was what Curtis had. $800 was roughly 12 times that. The man slid the sheet across the counter. "Who's putting this up, your dad, or is he hiring it done?" Curtis said he was building it himself. The man looked at him a second longer than the question needed, then nodded the way you nod at something you've decided not to argue about, and turned away to help the fellow who'd come in behind him. Curtis kept writing. He got the last number down, thanked the man's back, and walked out to the truck. He had been carrying that problem around for 3 months when the railroad came up. The railroad was not stupid, and neither was Rick Thornton. There was a sound reason that iron was lying in the weeds, and if you miss the reason, you'll miss what Curtis actually did. Scrap sold by the ton, and the ton price was not large. What made a salvage job pay was full-length rail, pulled clean and loaded in bulk. Everything else was a nuisance. Short ends cut out at road crossings, pieces bent out of true by some derailment back in the 30s, rail worn so crooked on one side it could never be relaid. Every one of them still weighed 100 pounds or better, and to sell them you had to pay men to find them, lift them, and load them. So the railroad wasn't throwing away steel, it was throwing away labor, and so was Rick Thornton. Which is the whole story right there 10 minutes in. Everybody on that grade ran the same arithmetic and got the same answer. Not worth the trouble. One 19-year-old ran a different equation because he was the only man on the property whose time didn't cost him anything. Let me tell you about Curtis's grandfather because the knowledge in this story didn't start with Curtis. It started with a man who had been dead 4 years by the time any of this happened. Silas Hargrove had come north on a section gang, and a section gang in the 20s was not a machine operation. It was men. Men with bars and mauls and spike hammers keeping 10 miles of track engaged with their arms. And a section gang had a forge because things broke and there was nobody coming to fix them. Silas was the man at that forge. He made his own chisels. He made his own wedges. He drew out spike pullers when the heads split. And when he needed something to beat against, he did what every railroad blacksmith in America did. He took a 14-inch chunk of rail, set it head up in a stump, and called it an anvil. That chunk of rail was still in the Hargrove machine shed in 1962. Curtis had been hammering things flat on it since he was 6 years old. Now Silas told his grandson exactly one thing about that iron, and he told it more than once, the way old men repeat the things they consider important. The way Silas told it, and he was a blacksmith, not a metallurgist, and he'd never read a word about any of this. Rail steel was simply not the same animal as the steel a man buys. Ordinary structural steel was soft on purpose, so you could cut it and drill it and bend it. Rail was made for a harder life than that, and it came out of the mill with more carbon in it and a temper to match. And then, Silas said, the wheels went to work on it, and the wheels only ever made it worse tempered. Whether an engineer would have put it that way, I couldn't tell you. It was what one old man believed after 40 years of hitting the stuff. Then he told his grandson the second half, which was the half that mattered. Look at the shape of it. Because a rail is not a bar. A rail is a beam. Wide foot, thin web, heavy head. The profile a man draws when he wants the most stiffness out of the least metal. Somebody had already done that arithmetic in 1911 and paid for it and rolled it out in a mill in Pennsylvania. And then Silas said the sentence his grandson would still be repeating 20 years later. You don't cut it. You don't weld it. You bolt it, or you set it in stone. Curtis was 15 when he heard that. He did not know yet what he would ever do with it. Let me tell you how a 19-year-old moved 7 tons of railroad iron with no crane, no crew, and no help he didn't have to beg for. He didn't lift it. He borrowed his father's flatbed trailer, laid 2 heavy planks off the back as a ramp, and hooked a hand winch, a come-along, ratchet, and cable, the kind hanging in every farm shop in Iowa, to the front of the deck. Then he rolled each piece up the planks, 1 crank at a time, on its side. 100 pounds, 200 pounds, 141 pieces, ranging from 4 feet to 9 over 3 days. His younger brother Cliff quit on the second afternoon, said something unrepeatable about the temperature and the weight and the whole idea, threw his gloves in the ditch and walked to the truck. He came back 40 minutes later. He picked the gloves out of the ditch. He didn't say anything, and neither did Curtis. Everybody who walked past that iron measured it in pounds. Curtis measured it in afternoons. Now, this next part is the part I want you to hold on to. because everything Curtis Hargrove ever became is contained in it. He got that iron home, stacked in the machine shed off the dirt on blocking. And then, for 3 weeks, he did absolutely nothing with it. He didn't cut. He didn't build. He didn't so much as draw a plan. He measured. He laid pieces side by side on the shed floor and got down on his knees with a straight edge. He ran his thumb along the head of each one, feeling for the lip that 50 years of wheels leave on the inside edge. He flipped them. He rapped them with a hammer and listened to the ring, because a sound piece rings and a cracked one thuds. Now let me pause here and ask you something. When was the last time you saw a 19-year-old spend 3 weeks staring at a pile of iron that everybody else in the county had already decided was garbage? Not working it, learning it. And in that 3 weeks, he learned 2 things the hard way and 1 thing by accident. And the accident is the best part. Here's the first hard lesson. He tried to drill a hole. He broke 3 bits in 40 minutes. Not dulled, snapped. High-carbon steel does not care about a farm shop drill press and a 5-cent bit. Here's the second. He got out his father's cutting torch because if you can't drill it, you cut it, and every man in Iowa believes that. The cut went through, but the metal alongside the cut changed color, and when he took a file to it afterward, the file bit in easy. He had burned the hardness right out of it. He had taken the one thing that made the material special and destroyed it in about 90 seconds. He set the torch down and sat on an overturned bucket and looked at the pile. You don't cut it. You don't weld it. He had been hearing that sentence since he was 15. He had never once understood it until the moment he sat on that bucket with a ruined piece of rail in front of him. And then he looked up, and he saw the holes. There were holes in the end of every single piece of rail in that shed. Round, clean, evenly spaced holes through the web, 3 or 4 to an end. They had been punched at the mill in 1911, so that the rails could be bolted together end to end with joint bars, which is how every mile of track in America was assembled before anybody welded anything. The railroad had drilled them 51 years earlier. Curtis had been standing on the answer for 2 days. He didn't have to make a connection point. He had 141 pieces of the hardest steel in the county, and every one of them came from the factory pre-drilled at both ends. That is what 3 weeks of looking buys you. There was one more thing, and he found it because he was still measuring after most people would have stopped. The wear on a rail is not even. Wheels ride the inside edge, so a rail wears down on one side and stays high on the other. Lay a row of them all facing the same way, and you build in a tilt. So he turned every other one end for end. The worn side of one piece sat against the unworn side of the next, and the tilt canceled itself out across the row. He checked it with a level and a chalk line on the shed floor before he ever poured an ounce of concrete. Nobody taught him that. There was nobody to teach him that. He brought it to his father on an evening in April. Roland Hargrove listened all the way through without interrupting, which was his way. When his son finished, he was quiet for long enough that the clock in the front room became audible. "How much does the cement cost?" Curtis gave him the figure. His father nodded once, barely. "And the iron's free." It wasn't a question. Curtis said yes anyway. Roland turned his coffee cup a quarter turn on the oilcloth and looked at it. "I'd have to think on that." Ruby Hargrove was at the sink with her back to the table. She did not turn around. She did not stop washing. "He's right, Roland." Roland Hargrove looked at the back of his wife's head for a while. Then he picked up the coffee cup. "Pour your slab." Let me tell you how that slab got poured, because the method matters as much as the material. He had no mixer truck. The ready-mix outfit in Eldora had a minimum order bigger than his whole job and a delivery charge he couldn't absorb. No pump, no vibrator, no power screed. What he had was a half-bag mixer rented from the hardware store in Acre, gravel dug out of the drainage ditch bank on his father's ground, Portland cement bought 2 sacks at a time, his brother's wheelbarrow, his father's garden cart, and Cliff, who agreed to 2 weekends in exchange for 2 weeks of fence mending, which Cliff hated only slightly less than mixing concrete. He prepared the ground first, and this is where the whole thing could have died. That quarter-acre was low, wet, the kind of site that heaves in a freeze and cracks anything you put on it. So he dug the entire footprint down 14 inches, 22 feet by 18, and filled the bottom 8 with ditch gravel, compacted in lifts. He got that number out of a pamphlet. The county extension agent was a man named Hollis Bergstrom, and Curtis had gone into his office in Eldora to ask about drainage on wet sites. Bergstrom found him the Iowa State Bulletin on slab preparation and handed it over. Then he explained the gravel base to him. Then, a minute later, he explained the gravel base to him again, slightly slower. And then Bergstrom told him, in a friendly and completely sincere way, that a boy with no construction experience pouring his own slab on a drainage problem was going to end up with a cracked mess he would have to break up and haul off. Curtis thanked him for the pamphlet. He folded it into his shirt pocket. He drove home. Now, I want to be honest with you about what this was. There was no engineer on this job, no permit, no inspection, no code book. This was 1962, on a man's own ground, in a county where a farmer built what he needed and found out over the next 30 years whether he'd built it right. The only test that ever mattered here was time. Here's what he did with the iron. He set the rail down into the prepared base on its foot, the wide, flat bottom, with the hardened head pointing up. He ran the pieces in rows across the short dimension of the floor. Every other one turned end for end, and he bolted the rows to each other through those factory holes with salvaged track bolts he'd picked out of the same weeds. Then he poured concrete over the whole thing in 4-foot strips, working across the floor over 3 weekends, mixing every batch by hand. Cliff mixed, Curtis screeded. Their mother brought sandwiches at noon. Their father came by on the second Saturday, stood at the edge of the work for about 20 minutes without a word, and went back to the field. Let me tell you about the night it almost ended. Late April. He had poured the last strip that afternoon, and by 9 o'clock the temperature was dropping faster than it had any business dropping. Every man who had ever poured anything had told him the same thing about green concrete and a hard freeze, and he believed them. If that slab froze before it set, he lost it. All of it. 58 of his $67 was in the ground under his feet, and there was no second $67 coming. So he hauled straw. He covered the whole floor and weighted the edges. He built a fire at the corner and sat down next to it, and got up 3 times in the night to put his palm flat on the surface through the straw. And somewhere in there, sitting in the dark with the fire going, he put his hand on the end of a piece of rail sticking out past the edge of the pour. It was cold. Metal cold. Cold the way concrete is not. And for the first time, a question occurred to him that he could not answer. Steel and concrete, locked together, in Iowa. 40 winters of freeze and thaw. What happens? He didn't know. His grandfather had never told him because his grandfather had never done it. He put another log on the fire and sat back down, and that question went into him and stayed there. Hold on to it. Somebody else is going to ask it out loud in about 4 years. The slab came through the night, and 2 weeks later, before there was a single wall standing on it, Cliff drove their father's farm-all up onto that bare floor. Curtis had set a spirit level on the concrete about 3 feet from the wheel track. He crouched down beside it while his brother rolled the tractor across. The bubble did not move. Not a hair, not a tremble. 1.5 tons of iron rolled by 3 feet away, and the bubble sat dead center like it was painted there. Cliff shut the tractor off and looked at him. Curtis was still crouched down, still looking at the level, and he stayed like that for a good while after the engine quit. That afternoon, Rick Thornton drove past on the county road. He slowed. He looked at the work, then he drove on. He didn't stop. He didn't say anything to anybody. And Curtis, who was inside the shed sorting bolts, never even knew he'd gone by. When the slab was finished, he had $9 left, and the floor was only the beginning. $9 does not frame walls. But he had solved the problem once, and having solved it once, he understood that the solution was always going to be the same shape. Look at what other people are throwing away, then understand it better than they do. So he spent the summer of 1962 doing exactly that. He tore down 2 derelict outbuildings on neighboring farms for the siding, and the owners were glad to have the eyesores gone. He bought a load of used brick from a grain elevator in Radcliffe that was coming down for a parking lot. $15 for more brick than he needed. He found 3 used windows, still in their frames, at a farm sale over in Grundy County, $4 apiece. He traded 2 weeks of custom combining for a load of dimensional lumber from a man converting a dairy barn who had no use for the old framing. And in between all of it, he ran a combine for wages and did day labor for neighbors, and every dollar of it went straight back into that quarter acre. By September, the walls were framed, sheathed, and roofed. By November, the windows were in and the doors were hung. By Christmas, there was a small, tight, efficient house standing on ground nobody had ever been able to farm. Total materials, $214. Now hear me clearly because this number gets misquoted. $214 was materials. The labor was his, and it was not free. It just wasn't for sale. He moved in on the 2nd of January, 1963. He was 19 years old. Let me ask you something. How many people do you know who built their own house at 19? Not a cabin, not a shed, a house, poured slab, framed walls, a proper roof, windows, doors, insulation. And how many of them did it for $214? In Hardin County in 1963, the answer was 1. And for about 4 months, almost nobody knew. Messages. Let me tell you about the afternoon the floor stopped being a floor. That spring, Roland Hargrove had a workday at the home place. Clean out the machine shed, get it organized for the season. 15 neighbors came, the way neighbors did, and when the work was done, they all came in for coffee and pie, because Ruby Hargrove had made it clear that anybody who helped her husband was going to be fed properly. Most of those men knew the middle Hargrove boy had put up a house on the wet corner. Most of them assumed it was a rough affair. A young man's first try, serviceable, nothing to study. What stopped several of them in the doorway was that it wasn't. There was a silence when those men came through that door. It lasted maybe 2 seconds. It was the silence of a room full of grown men adjusting a picture in their heads. Of the Hargrove boy. Of what he was likely capable of what they'd have guessed if you'd asked them that morning. Nobody said a word about it. Not one man. That is exactly the point. That is what it was like. One of them, an older fellow from over toward Steamboat Rock, walked the length of the main room looking up at the ceiling line and then turned around. Who drew this up for you? Curtis said he drew it himself over the winter. The man asked where he'd taken his drafting. Curtis said he hadn't taken any. The man said, looked at the ceiling line again and let it go. And nobody in that room thought twice about the exchange except the one person in it who'd been asked. Then Harlan Voss brought his heel down on the floor. Voss farmed 400 acres north of Ackley and had built his own place in 1951. And he was the sort of man who tests things without deciding to. He stamped once in the middle of the room, then twice more out toward the wall. There was no hollow in it, anywhere. Every farmhouse floor in Iowa give you something back. A boom, a rattle, a little give under the heel. This one gave back nothing at all, like stamping on a road. Voss went down on one knee and rapped the surface with a knuckle, listening. Then he looked up. That's not concrete sitting on dirt. He knocked once more. That's concrete sitting on something. Rail. Voss got up slowly. He didn't say anything for a moment. He walked to the window and looked out to the north, out toward where the branch line used to run. My feed alley splits open every spring. He was still looking out the window. Every single spring, 12 years running. Harlan Voss did not ask Curtis to floor his house. He asked him to floor a dairy barn. 60 feet by 30, with a center feed alley that had to take a tractor and a loaded manure spreader every day of the year. Voss had priced commercial concrete hardeners, and he had priced epoxy coating, and he had been unhappy with both the cost and the promises. And he took his time about the asking. 6 months between that afternoon in the living room and the phone call. Nobody ever explained the 6 months, and I'd be inventing if I told you what went on in the man's head across a winter. But when he finally did call, the first thing out of his mouth was that he'd driven past the Hargrove place twice in November to look at it from the road. Curtis laid it in the spring of 1964. Cliff came along, and this time Cliff got paid in money instead of fence mending, which was a small thing, and also the exact moment a farm kid with an idea turned into a man running a job. Same method. Prepared base. Rail set foot down, head up, every other piece turned end for end, bolted through the factory holes. Concrete over the top. Curtis charged $40 for the labor, which was less than the work was worth, and he knew it was less than the work was worth. But he was not really being paid in dollars on that job. He was being paid in a barn floor he could point at. When it was done, Voss walked the length of the alley once, from the north door to the south. He did not stamp on it. He'd already done that a year ago in another man's living room and gotten his answer. That'll do. It went through its first winter without a crack. One winter. And here is the thing I want you to know about Curtis Hargrove. One winter did not satisfy him at all. He had sat by a fire with his hand on a cold piece of rail and asked himself a question, and one winter is not an answer to that question. He knew that better than anybody in the county. Rick Thornton's business was doing fine through all of this. Second crew, used backhoe, steady volume of foundation work across 3 counties. He had built his name on speed and on modern equipment, and he was proud of that, the way men are proud of things they have worked hard for. He heard about the Voss floor at the co-op counter in Acre in the fall of 1965, and his reaction was not curiosity. Now, I could make this easy on you and tell you he was a fool. He wasn't. Listen to what he actually said because it's important. He said that steel rusts, and rust swells. It takes up more room than the metal it came from, and that swelling inside a slab will push the concrete apart from the inside out. That is a real failure mode. Men have lost bridges to it. He said that reinforcing steel is deformed on purpose, ribbed so concrete can grip it, and that a rail is a big, smooth chunk of nothing for concrete to hold on to. And he said that there was no engineer on any of it, no warranty, and nobody on God's earth to stand behind it if a man's barn floor came apart under a loaded spreader in February. Those are not the objections of an idiot. Those are the 3 questions any honest man in the trade is obligated to ask. The concrete supplier out of Iowa Falls, who sold to both of them and was a careful sort, heard him out and then shrugged. Maybe so. Voss's alley is a year old and it hasn't moved an inch. Give it time. He said it in the tone a man uses when he is finished with a subject, and the subject closed. So they gave it time. 4 more winters went across that feed alley. 4 full freeze and thaw cycles, with a tractor and a loaded spreader over it every day, and the manure scraper dragging steel across it twice a day besides. Not one crack, not one lifted edge, not one spot where the surface went hollow under a hammer handle. The plain concrete in the other half of that same barn had never once made it through a winter without splitting. And that question Curtis had asked himself at 3 in the morning by a straw fire in 1962, what do 40 Iowa winters do to steel locked in concrete, got answered. Not by him, by the calendar, which is the only thing that ever really answers a question like that. Now let me tell you about the summer of 1966, because this is where it stops being a story about a floor. A farmer named Vernon Kessler was putting up a 60 by 40 machine shed in the east end of the county, and he hired Rick Thornton to pour the slab. Thornton poured it in June. By July, it had diagonal cracks running from the corners toward the middle, the classic pattern of a slab poured too fast, or on ground that wasn't ready, or both. Kessler called him. Thornton came out, looked, and said the cracks were superficial, within tolerance for agricultural work, and would not affect anything structurally. Kessler was not a concrete man. He accepted that explanation with the particular unhappiness of somebody who knows he has just been managed and can't prove it. They were not superficial. By September, 2 of them had opened to a 1/4 inch, and one had developed a vertical offset, one side of the crack standing higher than the other by 3/8 of an inch, which means the slab had moved differentially, which means the ground underneath it had never been right. Kessler called again. Thornton came out again and said the offset was within tolerance and the slab was still serviceable. Kessler asked what he was supposed to do about a crack wide enough to catch a tractor tire. Thornton said he could fill it with joint compound. Kessler asked who was paying for that. That conversation did not end well. The next week, Kessler called Curtis Hargrove. Curtis drove out on a Tuesday morning. He walked that slab for 20 minutes, crouching at every crack, running a finger down the offset, tapping across the surface with a hammer handle, and listening for the flat, dead sound that means there's a void underneath. Then he stood up and told Vernon Kessler 3 things. That 2 of the cracks really were superficial and could be filled and forgotten. That the offset crack was going to get worse with every freeze and would eventually have to be cut out and re-poured. And that the base under the failed section had never been deep enough. Less than 6 inches of stone on clay. How do you know that? Curtis was still crouched down. He didn't get up and he didn't look over. Because I've seen this crack before, on other jobs. He did not say whose jobs. He did not have to. Kessler looked at the back of his head for a long moment and then asked him what it would cost to fix. Now. Vernon Kessler told that story at the co-op that fall to 4 different men, and 3 of those 4 remembered exactly what Rick Thornton had said about railroad iron a few years earlier, and all 3 of them filed the contrast away without comment. And Thornton never heard about that morning. Not once. In a county like Hardin, the things people know about you are almost never the things they say to you. The stretch between 1966 and 1971 is the quiet part. Quiet years are where practices get built. The 60s were the decade the branch lines died. All across Iowa, the little spurs that served elevators in towns of 400 people were being abandoned, mile by mile, as trucks took the grain. And every abandonment left the same thing behind in the weeds. So Curtis put word out through the co-op network, which is how information actually moves in a farm county. He would come and haul rail off any abandonment in the area, free, no charge to anybody. By 1969, he had more of it stacked and graded than he expected to need for years. He kept taking it anyway. His grandfather had told him a long time ago that nobody was going to make any more of it, and when the branch lines were gone, they were going to be gone. Between 1966 and the spring of 1971, he set rail and concrete floors in 11 buildings across Hardin County and the 2 counties next to it. Machine sheds, dairy barns, a hog building, a feed facility, 3 residential additions. Same method every time. He never changed it because it worked, and changing things that work for the sake of changing them was not how the man thought. But he refined inside it, and that's the part worth hearing. He figured out that not all rail is equally hardened. A piece that spent 50 years in a curve got worked far harder on one side than a piece out of tangent track. So he made himself a tester, a good file and a spring scale, and learned to grade every piece by how the file bit into the head. The hardest went where the heaviest wheels would run. The softer ones went to the edges and the low traffic bays. That is the kind of refinement that only comes from paying attention for years. You can't buy it, and you can't be taught it in an afternoon. He married Loretta Pruitt out of Eldora in 1965. Their son was born in 1967. They put his grandfather's name on the birth certificate, Silas, after the man who used to forge chisels out of railheads. And one evening in the fall of 1970, Loretta came out to the shed to call them in to supper and found her husband sorting rail along the north wall by file test, and her 3-year-old sitting on the floor 8 feet away working through a coffee can of track bolts. He was laying them out in a line, longest to shortest. She called him twice. He did not get up until the line was finished. Let me tell you about the morning Rick Thornton turned into Curtis Hargrove's lane. Thornton was 43 by then. The business was still running and still profitable, but the market had tightened. Farm consolidation meant fewer operations, which meant fewer buildings. He'd lost 2 bids in a year to outfits from out of county undercutting him on price, and he had lost 1 more, and this one had gone in under the ribs. A new dairy operation up in Franklin County had specified a rail-set floor for the milking parlor. Thornton had looked at that line in the specification and realized he did not know what it was, could not price it, and had no way to bid it. He lost that job to Curtis Hargrove. He sat in his truck in the yard for a while before he got out. Curtis was at the bench grinder putting an edge on a scraper blade. He saw the truck come in and he recognized it, and he set the blade down on the bench. Thornton came in through the shed door and stood a moment, letting his eyes come down out of the April glare. He looked at the rows of rails stacked and graded along the north wall, chalk marks on every piece. Then he looked at Curtis. "I heard you got the Franklin County job." Curtis didn't shut the grinder off right away. "I did." Then he did shut it off. The motor wound down and the shed got very quiet, and Thornton looked at the floor for a second and then said the thing he had driven 12 miles to say. "I had 2 miles of that iron, son." He stopped there. Then he made himself finish it. 2 miles. I stood on it every day for a month. I paid 3 men to drag it out of the weeds and pile it up where it wouldn't be in the way, and then I walked off and left it lying there, because I couldn't be bothered to think about it for 10 minutes. Curtis didn't say anything, which is exactly what made Thornton keep going. "I need to know how you do it." Curtis looked at him for a while. When he answered, there was nothing in his voice, no heat, no satisfaction. He just said it the way you'd state a fact about the weather. "You told me it was garbage." Thornton's jaw set. "I know what I said." Curtis nodded. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said the thing that Rick Thornton would repeat to other men more than once over the next 8 years. "The problem with calling something garbage is that you stop looking at it. And when you stop looking at a thing, you stop learning what it can do." He picked the blade up off the bench. "Come back Saturday morning. I'll show you all of it." Let me tell you what happened Saturday, because the showing was as important as the method. He did not give Rick Thornton the short version. He did not hand him a simplified account suitable for a man who was going to do it once and move on. He showed him the whole thing, start to finish, 4 hours in the machine shed and out at the shop floor. He showed him the base preparation and how deep it had to go on clay and why. He showed him the file test and had Thornton do it himself on 3 pieces until he could feel the difference between a curve rail and a tangent rail with his own hands. He showed him the wear on the heads and laid 2 pieces down and turned one end for end so Thornton could see the tilt cancel. He showed him the factory bolt holes and told him what his grandfather had told him. You don't cut it, you don't weld it, you bolt it, or you set it in stone. And then he told him exactly what happens to the metal alongside a torch cut, because he had ruined a piece finding out. He showed him the slurry consistency and how to test it with a finger. Thin enough to flow, thick enough to hold. He answered every question Thornton asked. There were a lot of them. Thornton left that afternoon with 3 pages of notes in his own handwriting, and by the account of the men who saw him that week, with a different face than the one he'd arrived with. Not humbled, exactly. Thornton was not a man who humbled easily. Quieter, more careful. The look of somebody who has spent a morning in the presence of knowledge he did not have, and now has to decide what to do about it. And in 4 hours, Curtis Hargrove never once mentioned a Tuesday morning in March of 1962. Not a word, not a look, not one of those little digs a man is entitled to. I've thought about that a lot. I think he understood something most of us never manage, that the moment you collect on it, you turn it into a transaction, and it stops being worth anything. Now, here's the part of this story that the easy version leaves out. Thornton took the method and used it. He worked it into his bidding on agricultural jobs across 3 counties, and he did 8 of those floors himself before he retired. And he told people where he got it, which nobody made him do. A farmer over in Hamilton County asked him straight out one afternoon where he'd learned a thing like that. Thornton folded up his tape and put it in his pocket before he answered. Man over in Hardin County, Curtis Hargrove. He's been doing it since '62. Then he said the second half, which is the half that costs something. You want it done right? Call him. You want my crew? I'll tell you straight. He taught me, and he's better at it than I am. He said some version of that for 8 years. 11 clients went from Rick Thornton to Curtis Hargrove between 1971 and 1979. 11 jobs he could have bid himself and didn't. And I want you to sit with the shape of that for a second. The man who laughed at him on a Tuesday morning in 1962 turned into the best salesman he ever had, and brought him more work than his own reputation did. He never once called it making up for anything. I don't think he'd have known how to say it that way. Hollis Bergstrom had watched this spread across his county for 11 years, with the particular attention of a man who knows he was wrong about something and is trying to work out exactly how wrong. He had seen the Voss Alley. He had seen the Kessler repair. He had heard the accounts. In the summer of 1973, he drove out and asked if he could walk the floors. He did not stamp on anything. He did not rap on anything. He got out a tape and a notebook, and he measured, and he wrote things down. 20 minutes in the house, 30 in the shed. When he came out, he stood in the yard for a while looking at his own shoes. 11 years. Curtis said 11 years. In '62, I stood in my office and told you you'd end up with a cracked mess you'd have to break up and haul off. Curtis said he remembered. Bergstrom flipped back through the notebook to a page near the front and stopped on it. That base, 14 inches, 8 of stone, compacted in lifts. He looked up. That spec came out of my own pamphlet. It did. Bergstrom looked at the paper in his hand for a long moment. I'd like to write this up. The bulletin ran 4 pages. Salvaged rail in slab construction. Field observations from Hardin County, Iowa. It went out to county agents across the state in the fall of 1973. It carried the method in detail. It carried performance data from 11 installations over 11 years. It carried a cost comparison, and it carried a line, near the bottom, in the flat voice of a state document, recommending that anyone applying the technique under significant load consult qualified engineering assistants first. And it named Curtis Hargrove as the originator of the method and printed his address. 47 inquiries came in over the following 6 months. He answered every one of them. Let me tell you what those floors were actually like to live on, because it is not what you'd guess. People expect me to say they were warm. They weren't. Concrete over steel is cold under a bare foot in February, and Loretta Hargrove put down rugs like everybody else. What they were was silent. Think about a farmhouse in 1970. Every floor in the county talked. Somebody crossed the kitchen and the boards spoke. A door slammed and the cups moved in the cupboard. Somebody came in late and every single person in the house knew which room he went to. That house didn't do any of it. A child could run the length of it at a dead sprint, and Loretta swore she never once heard him coming. You could close a door as hard as you liked, and nothing anywhere in that building answered you back. And here's the thing people did without knowing they were doing it. They came through that door and they got quieter. Their voices came down. Something in the floor told them, below the level of thinking about it, that this was a solid place. And they responded to it the way you respond in a stone church. Nobody could ever explain it. They just did it. When people asked Curtis why his floors felt different, he gave the same answer every time, and he never elaborated on it. The steel already did its work. You're just giving it a new job. Let me tell you about the last thing. Silas Hargrove II was 14 years old in the spring of 1981, and he had been carrying bolts and running the file test on job sites since he was 10. He had grown up on a floor that was by then 19 years old and had never cracked. One evening in March, he came out to the machine shed with a notebook. Not his father's notebook. His own. A spiral composition book he'd been filling for months. He didn't set it on the workbench. He set it down on the 14-inch chunk of rail standing head up in the stump in the corner, the one his great-grandfather had used as an anvil on a section gang in 1923. "Dad, I've been looking at the Rock Island." And that stopped Curtis Hargrove where he stood. Because this was not a 2-mile spur out on the north edge of the county. The Rock Island had gone under. Not a branch. The whole railroad, one of the great American systems, shut down and being cut apart across 5 states. That summer, crews were pulling rail out of Iowa by the hundreds of miles. The boy had been out to look at it. He had counted crossings and measured sections and worked out tonnage. He had gone to the steel supplier in Marshalltown and priced new material to compare against. It was all in the book, in a 14-year-old's handwriting, with the arithmetic shown. Curtis looked at that notebook for a long time. He was thinking about a Tuesday morning in March of 1962, about a man laughing with his cap in his hand, about his grandfather's voice telling him to look at the shape of the thing, about his mother standing at a sink with her back to the table, not turning around. "How much do you figure they'll want for it?" His son said he thought they might let it go for nothing at all if somebody would agree to haul it off themselves. Curtis nodded. He slid the notebook back across the anvil toward the boy. "Call them Monday." Let me tell you one last thing, because this is the part that stays with you. That floor is still there. It was poured in the spring of 1962 over steel that was rolled in a Pennsylvania mill in 1911, and then spent half a century getting beaten into hardness by the wheels of trains hauling Iowa corn to Chicago. Which means the metal under that house has been carrying weight continuously for more than 110 years. You cannot buy that. You cannot manufacture it. Nobody sells 50 years of wheels. It can only be recognized by somebody who understands what he is looking at while everyone else is looking at the same thing and seeing trash. Hollis Bergstrom retired in 1984, and at the ceremony he said that the most important thing he had learned in 30 years as a county agent was that the people most likely to be right about something new are very often the people with the least official reason to be listened to. He did not say Curtis Hargrove's name in that speech. He had already put it in the bulletin 11 years earlier in print, where it would still be sitting in a file drawer in every county in the state long after everybody in that room was gone. That was the mention that mattered, and Bergstrom knew it. Rick Thornton retired in 1979. 11 referrals, 8 floors of his own, and by every account of the men who worked for him, a considerably more careful man about ground preparation after 1971 than he had ever been before it. Whether that carefulness carried into the rest of his life is harder to say. It carried into his trade. For a man like Thornton, those may be closer to the same thing than we'd assume. The farmers old enough to have walked on those floors still remember him. The younger ones know the floors without knowing the story. They step into an old barn, feel that dead, solid nothing under their boots, and understand only that somebody built this right. That not knowing is its own kind of loss. But the floors themselves are a kind of knowing, a record, written in steel, of what one 19-year-old understood about patience and material, and the difference between garbage and treasure. He asked for what everyone else was leaving in the weeds. He understood it better than they did. And it is still down there, under other men's floors, in the dark, holding weight, quiet, 60 years later. If this one stayed with you, leave a comment and tell me what you'd have done standing in front of that pile. And subscribe, there's another story coming.